My name is Susan Johnson. I'm the president of AFSA, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this occasion. I wanted to mention more formally that we will be sort of recording this. It will be posted on the WETA website, and we at AFSA will be circulating it to the bulk of our membership, which is distributed across the globe. So, and for those who are not able to get away during working hours to come to this sort of event. So, just to let you all know. But it's really a pleasure to have you. Appreciate your being here. I think we're going to be hearing from a very interesting speaker on a topic that is central to our business of diplomacy. Thanks, I think, in large part to AFSA's Executive Director, Ian Houston, who's going to be doing an introduction. We have launched this series, Book Notes, in which we're inviting authors to come and present their books and the ideas behind it to a group here in an informal setting for question, answer, and discussion. So again, a big welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here, and let me turn the podium over to Ian Houston, who will introduce our speaker for today. Thank you. Ian?
Well, thank you very much, Susan. And also extend my warm wishes to everyone. I appreciate you being there, particularly to our WETA audience. Thank you for watching today's broadcast. So we are so grateful to have Fred here with us today. Fredrik Stanton has really carried through something that many of us wish to do. That is, we have an idea for a book, whether it's fiction, nonfiction. Many of us don't carry it across the finish line, but Fred has, in a very inspirational way, has researched his topic, has written obviously quite a bit, has coherently brought together an excellent piece of work in his relationship with a terrific publisher. A publisher always needs to be mentioned in these endeavors, Westholme. And all of that, the fact that he has brought together a terrific product deserves our respect. And this is a very thoughtful piece of work, and we're very thankful to have Fred here with us. I particularly would also like to recognize Judge and Mrs. Louise Stanton. Judge Stanton, the father, and his wife are here, the parents of Fred, and they've come down from New York after an interesting event at the White House, I think, this morning. So thank you very much for being here, Judge, and we appreciate always interactions with different audiences, and we think this has afforded that opportunity. Here we are to discuss this book, Great Negotiations, Agreements That Change the Modern World. Drawing on primary resources, transcripts, and interviews, the book tells the story of 8 key episodes in modern diplomacy. From Benjamin Franklin securing crucial French support for the American Revolution to Reagan and Gorbachev laying the groundwork to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. Fred, in his book, explains that each party brought to the negotiating table the stakes, the obstacles to success, and how those obstacles were overcome. And he will obviously in more detail get into this. But the book focuses on 8 particular negotiations: Franklin at the French court, the Louisiana Purchase, the Congress of Vienna. In fact, Susan and I were just talking about this morning about that. The Portsmouth Treaty, the Paris Peace Conference, the Arab-Israeli Accord, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Reykjavik Summit. So this is the book, and I'd say just by way of introduction of Fred, that Fred is a former president of the Columbia Daily Spectator and has written for the Boston Herald and the UN's A Global Agenda. He was an election monitor in Armenia, Republic of Georgia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Azerbaijan. And so I'll turn it over to Fred. Thank you, Fred.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'd like to thank AFSA. I'd like to thank Susan Johnson, the president, and I'd like to thank Ian Houston for setting this up this morning. Words, as much as weapons, shape history. In the modern age, diplomacy has had great triumphs and bitter failures, from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which narrowly spared humanity from nuclear Armageddon, to the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, which created problems that still confront us today. In negotiation, great opportunity lies alongside the potential for disaster, and the rules are often written while the game is played. These unique moments, the highest stakes poker games in history, provide individuals, armed only with cunning, determination, and charisma, an opportunity to leave an immediate and lasting mark on the fates of nations. Clausewitz described warfare as politics by other means, and in the same vein, negotiations can be seen as war by other means. Negotiating, always at the heart of diplomacy, remains one of the indispensable tools of statecraft. When it works, it seems like magic, the ability to reconcile opposing elements, or to create a situation that leaves both sides better off than before. Major negotiations, which Churchill called conversations of silk and steel, are made of contradictions, confrontation and collaboration, conflict and seduction. The stakes are high, the margin for error is small, and the clock is ticking. With lives and nations' fates in the balance, participants must use perseverance, creativity, bluff, and the ability to capitalize on the unexpected to overcome obstacles to agreement, which may include their adversary, the strategic environment, and even the demands of their own side. Despite their challenges, negotiators can accomplish amazing victories. The Louisiana Purchase turned a potential war into an opportunity for one of history's greatest acquisitions. In securing the Treaty of Portsmouth, Theodore Roosevelt helped save 250,000 lives and prevented a world war. Kennedy and Khrushchev successfully navigated a crisis that insiders had given a 50% chance of leading to nuclear holocaust. The book looks at 8 negotiations, their stakes, their stories, and their results. And I'll give you a taste this morning of a few illustrative examples. When the American colonies declared independence in July 1776, the Continental Army was short of weapons and gunpowder, as the Continental Congress struggled to feed, clothe, and supply thousands of troops in the face of a British trade ban and naval blockade. General Washington's forces had less than 5 rounds of ammunition per soldier. This was kept secret even from our people, Benjamin Franklin confided in a letter to a friend. The world wondered that we so seldom fired a cannon. We could not afford it. The Revolutionary Army badly needed foreign currency and war material from abroad. Muskets, cannon, ships, gunpowder, and other goods America could not produce domestically. France, England's traditional adversary for hundreds of years, was aware of the importance of the American colonies to British power. Lord Chatham, a former British Prime Minister, called them the fountain of our wealth, the nerve of our strength, the nursery and basis of our naval power. Congress naturally turned to France, which had already covertly provided money and supplies to the army, as a possible ally against Britain. Supporting the American Revolution offered France an opportunity to settle old scores, punish its historic enemy, and by depriving England of a principal source of its wealth and power, restore the balance of power in Europe in France's favor. The Americans held a weak hand. Washington's 5,000 men were outnumbered 6-1, and the day Benjamin Franklin, sent by Congress to secure French support, reached Paris, news arrived of Washington's defeats in Long Island and New York. On the continent, few expected the rebellion would last the year. France, while supportive of the colonists, was deeply in debt, and the king and his ministers had no interest in provoking a war with England. Furthermore, as a monarchy, France was reluctant to openly support colonists in rebellion against their king. Franklin's initial overtures were gently but firmly rebuffed. Congress also sent envoys to Tuscany, Vienna, and Berlin, but the prevailing belief the revolution would soon fail caused them to turn the American representatives away. In Paris, Franklin and his colleagues received a letter from Robert Morris, writing on behalf of Congress. Unless help arrived soon, the future looked bleak for the revolution. Soldiers lacked muskets and gunpowder. British General Henry Clinton had taken Rhode Island. The British, who occupied New York, had chased Washington's ragged, barefoot soldiers through New Jersey and driven them across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Inflation was out of control, and with the American currency nearly worthless, Congress found it increasingly difficult to raise money to keep the army in the field. Franklin's negotiations with the French government went nowhere. Wary of causing an open breach with England and of being sucked into war, the French ministry provided covert aid, but nothing more. The winter of 1777, the revolution hung by a thread. The Continental Army, camped at Valley Forge, had 25 barrels of flour for 11,000 men, and many starved. An army of skeletons appeared before our eyes, naked, starved, sick, and discouraged, Gouverneur Morris, a member of the Continental Congress, reported after a visit. Almost 3,000 died, some frozen to death, others of illness or hunger. The unfortunate soldiers, wrote the Marquis de Lafayette, who'd traveled to the United States to fight with the Continental Army, were in want of everything. They had neither coats, nor hats, nor shirts, nor shoes. Their feet and their legs froze until they were black. It was often necessary to amputate them. On February 1778, General Washington wrote that our present sufferings are not all. There is no foundation laid for any adequate relief hereafter. All the magazines provided in the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, and all the immediate additional supplies they seem capable of affording, will not be sufficient to support the army more than a month longer, if so long. Franklin then did something unexpected. He agreed to meet with Britain's chief spy in Europe, who had been sent as an envoy to Paris to present Franklin with peace terms that satisfied many of the colonists' original demands, but fell short of independence. Franklin had no interest in the proposal, but the meeting, which he knew would be reported by the efficient French Secret Service, signaled that the Americans might be willing, after all, to entertain reconciliation with Britain, and, as Franklin intended, left the French Foreign Ministry under the impression that Franklin had begun negotiating terms. The next morning, the French Foreign Minister approached Franklin with a draft treaty of alliance with the United States. Within 5 months, France and England were at war. Spain joined the fight against Britain a year later in return for a French promise to help it capture Gibraltar from the British. French help was indispensable in turning the tide of the war. 90% of the gunpowder used by Washington's army came from France. The French shipped over 30,000 muskets, 400 tons of gunpowder, 5,000 tents, and 60 pieces of field artillery. American soldiers wore French clothes, fired French weapons, and their wages were largely paid by France. The combined might of the French and Spanish navies broke the British Navy's monopoly of the Atlantic, and by threatening an invasion force off the English Channel, as well as fighting in Mediterranean, Gibraltar, the Caribbean, and India, turned the war into a global conflict and forced a dispersion of British forces that fatally weakened the British war effort. Support for the American war cost the French treasury over 1 billion livres, equal to 3 times France's national budget, drove the country deeply into debt, and led to taxes that provoked the French Revolution in 1789. An example of the pitfalls of negotiating is the Treaty of Versailles. On November 11th, 1918, An armistice between Germany and the Allied powers of England, France, Italy, and the United States brought the fighting of the First World War to an end. In its 5 years, the war had spread to every corner of the earth and bled Europe dry with 40 million casualties. And the desolation it left behind caused people to look to the peace negotiations with a blend of euphoria and anticipation. The scope and ambitions of the peace conference went beyond anything that had come before. Geographically, politically, socially, and economically, it was to redraw the boundaries of the known world. The collapse of the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires washed away the imperial system that had dominated Europe since the Middle Ages, and in its place, long-suppressed nationalistic ambitions, encouraged by wartime promises from the Allies, rose and took hold from the Baltic to the Middle East. Economically, both the victors and the defeated were ruined. The subjugation of industry to military needs, the loss of working-age populations to the front, and the ravages of war had led to a breakdown in production. Germany and Central Europe were in the early stages of mass starvation, and France was only months behind. In Vienna, for lack of cotton cloth, the maternity hospitals put newborn babies in old newspapers. One of the British specialists recorded that in Bohemia, there is an absolute lack of milk and fats, with the result that something like 20% of the babies are born dead, and something like 40% die within the first month. In January 1919, the leaders of Europe and their allies gathered in Paris to hammer out the terms of peace and build a new order out of the ruins. 27 nations were invited to participate, representing 3/4 of the world's population. President Woodrow Wilson sought a German peace without vengeance, but French Premier Clemenceau and British Prime Minister Lloyd George had other priorities. Germany was stripped of its military, forced to pay impossible reparations, and surrender 13% of its territory, over 10% of its population, amounting to 7 million people, and half of its iron and steel production. The Paris Peace Conference, drew most of the borders of Europe as we now know them. After falling out of existence for hundreds of years, Poland was reunited into a sovereign nation with a population of 30 million. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had covered almost all of what is now known as Central Europe and traced its origins to classical Rome, had dissolved in the final days of the war, and its former possessions fell into near anarchy. Its collapse unleashed the aspirations of nations that had been suppressed for centuries, spurred by a promise by President Wilson of national self-determination. Czechoslovaks, Hungarians, Yugoslavs, Poles, Serbs, and dozens of others vied for statehood and competed over choice bits of territory. The statesmen at Paris soon found themselves confronting a thicket of overlapping ethnicities. These areas, Lloyd George marveled, were the mangrove swamps, where the racial roots were so tangled and intermingled that no peacemaker could move inside them without stumbling. The chief British Central European expert described the final decision on Central Europe made by the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. They began with Transylvania, and after some insults flung like tennis balls between the French National Security Advisor and the American Secretary of State, Hungary loses her south. Then Czechoslovakia, and while the flies drone in and out of the open windows, Hungary loses her north and east. Then the frontier with Austria, which is maintained intact. Oh, thank you. Then the Yugoslav frontier, where the committee's report is adopted without change. Then tea and macaroons. Austria's new borders contained only 1/4 of its previous territory and only 1/5 of its population. Czechoslovakia became independent. As a penalty for fighting on the losing side of the war, Bulgaria was forced to give up 4 border provinces to Yugoslavia and was subjected to reparations payments equal to its entire national wealth. The arrangement also ushered in the birth of the modern Middle East, establishing Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and eventually Lebanon and Jordan as separate nations, and laying the foundation for decades of continuing tension and conflict in the region. The Paris Peace Conference failed in its central purpose of averting another major war in Europe. Germany was left alienated, weakened, and embittered, but intact, and surrounded by a constellation of weak, ineffective states. A sense of foreboding cast a shadow over the delegates as they returned home. The outcome would lead, Secretary of State Lansing wrote, as surely as day follows night, to another war. French Chief of Staff Marshal Foch agreed. This is not peace, he declared. It is an armistice for 20 years. His prediction was off by only 65 days. Perhaps the greatest success in negotiation was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The seeds of the Cuban Missile Crisis were planted on New Year's Day 1959, when an insurrection led by Fidel Castro replaced General Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship with a Marxist government that turned Cuba into a client of the Soviet Union. The United States, alarmed by the establishment of a communist beachhead in the Western Hemisphere 90 miles from the Florida coast, tried to destabilize the Castro regime, and in April 1961 landed 1,200 armed Cuban exiles on the Bay of Pigs in a failed attempt to spark an uprising. Nearly all were killed or taken prisoner. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev worried that sooner or later the United States would try again with better luck and preparation, and spent the next 13 months searching for a way to protect his new and vulnerable Caribbean ally. While vacationing in Bulgaria in May 1962, he conceived an idea that with a single stroke could eliminate the possibility of future U.S.-backed invasions of Cuba, and nearly double the Soviet offensive nuclear strike capability against the United States. By placing Soviet missiles on the island, he could bypass the Soviet Union's 17-to-1 inferiority in strategic nuclear forces and reduce the warning time for incoming missiles from 20 minutes to less than 3. With Castro's consent, the operation, codenamed Anadir, began that summer. Over the course of 5 months, more than 80 ships, the entire sea lift capacity of the Soviet Union, secretly transported 42 medium-range missiles, 42 long-range bombers, 164 nuclear warheads, and 50,000 troops, advisors, and engineers, along with fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, and support vehicles across the Atlantic. Everything went according to Khrushchev's plan until an American U-2 spy plane returned on October 14th from a routine flight over western Cuba, with photographs clearly revealing the outline of a nearly completed missile launch site. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy informed President John F. Kennedy of the discovery over breakfast on October 16th. Kennedy and his advisors prepared for the worst. The president deployed 300 Navy warships to the Caribbean and South Atlantic in preparation for a blockade, mobilized 180,000 troops for a possible invasion of Cuba, the largest invasion force assembled since D-Day, and ordered U.S. missile forces to be ready to launch a full-scale nuclear strike within several minutes' notice. He ordered emergency supplies of food, water, and medicine to nuclear fallout shelters nationwide, and gave a speech to the nation on the evening of Monday, October 22, announcing the discovery of the missiles and his decision to impose a blockade of Cuba. The Soviets responded immediately. Following Kennedy's speech, Khrushchev activated the Soviet Union's strategic missile forces and ordered all Soviet ships bound for Cuba to maintain their course. Khrushchev convened the 12-man Presidium, the highest Soviet governing body, in the Kremlin and told them, "This may end in a big war." Khrushchev told an American executive in Moscow that he was interested in avoiding catastrophe. But if the United States insists on war, he warned, we'll all meet in hell. Over the course of 13 days, Kennedy and Khrushchev maneuvered at the edge of nuclear war. Through steely resolve and meticulous diplomacy, they arrived at a solution in which the Soviets backed down in exchange for a pledge by President Kennedy not to invade Cuba, and the secret withdrawal of obsolete American missiles in Turkey. The missiles and bombers in Cuba were quietly dismantled and shipped back to the Soviet Union. In the 24 years that followed the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet and American strategic nuclear arsenals grew 20-fold, and with both forces prepared to launch on several minutes' notice, the world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The superpowers made little progress despite years of arms control talks, and a series of accords, such as the nuclear test ban, anti-ballistic missile, and strategic arms limitation treaties, imposed limits on testing, anti-missile systems, and certain types of delivery vehicles, but failed to curb the growth of missiles and warheads. By 1985, mid-level talks in Geneva on strategic reductions stalled, and Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze called the traditional arms control process a well-traveled road that led nowhere. The world's nations, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev explained, were at an impasse. It seemed that the confrontation between East and West would go on forever. There seemed to be no way out, Shevardnadze wrote, except to slash the Gordian knot and destroy the world in the process. Both countries struggled under the weight of massive defense spending. In the United States, President Reagan embarked on a $3 trillion military buildup that caused record deficits. In the Soviet Union, the military consumed over 30% of the nation's gross national product, and it became evident to the country's leadership that the arms race was bankrupting the Soviet system. When I became head of state, Gorbachev wrote, it was already obvious that there was something wrong in this country. Doomed to serve ideology and bear the heavy burden of the arms race, it was strained to the utmost. The Soviet Union had fallen to 50th in the world in infant mortality rates, 3 times higher than the United States, and life expectancy was on par with Mexico, Brazil, and Costa Rica. We can't go on living like this, Gorbachev said to his wife the night before the Politburo appointed him General Secretary of the USSR in March 1985. The rush toward the abyss, he wrote, had to end. Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to an informal meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland, in early October, ostensibly to lay the groundwork for a possible summit at Washington the following year. Gorbachev laid out his goals to the Soviet team preparing for Reykjavik. If a new arms race began, he told them, the pressure on our economy will be inconceivable. He emphasized that to achieve lasting progress, there had to be advantages for the Americans as well. Nothing will come out of it, he said, if our proposals lead to a weakening of U.S. security. Gorbachev addressed the Politburo a couple days before his departure for Reykjavik and told them intermediate solutions would not be enough. If they impose a second round of arms race upon us, Gorbachev warned, we will lose. Reagan looked forward to the meeting. Years before, he observed, recalling his experience as head of the Actors Union, when I'd sat across the bargaining table from the executives who ran the Hollywood studios, I'd learned a few lessons about negotiating. You're unlikely to get ever all you want. You'll probably get more of what you want if you don't issue ultimatums and leave your adversary room for maneuver. You shouldn't back your adversary into a corner, embarrass him, or humiliate him. And sometimes, the easiest way to get some things done is for the top people to do them alone and in private. In a small room, in a house perched over the Atlantic, Reagan and Gorbachev first agreed to cut their strategic missile forces in half, then to eliminate all but 100 intermediate missiles worldwide, and finally, seized by the moment, to eliminate all nuclear weapons within 10 years. We were in a big game with high stakes, and the stakes were being raised every 5 minutes, Gorbachev observed. Both the negotiating teams realized that this was a unique opportunity to break out of the vicious circle of the nuclear arms race. President Reagan told the Soviet leader that 10 years from now he would be a very old man. He and Gorbachev would return to Iceland, and each would bring his country's last nuclear missile. Together they would destroy the last 2 missiles and throw a tremendous party for the whole world. But Gorbachev insisted that Reagan restrict research on strategic missile defense to the laboratory. Reagan refused. As evening approached, Reagan recalled, "I thought to myself, look what we have accomplished. We have negotiated the most massive weapons reduction in history. I thought we were in complete agreement and we were going to achieve something remarkable. Then, after everything had been decided, or so I thought, Gorbachev threw us a curve. With a smile on his face, he said, 'This all depends, of course, on you giving up SDI.' The leaders left without agreement. But while at the time Reykjavik was considered a failure, the proposals that had been tabled could not be undone, and the negotiation ultimately bore great fruit. Later that year, President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first to abolish an entire class of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union withdrew and destroyed more than 1,500 deployed nuclear warheads, and the United States withdrew and destroyed approximately 400. A treaty reducing strategic arms followed 4 years later. On July 31, 1991, President George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Following the framework laid down at Reykjavik, START cut American and Soviet strategic nuclear arsenals by half, to a maximum of 6,000 warheads each. On Christmas Day, 5 months after the signing of the START agreement, the Soviet Union collapsed, breaking peacefully apart into 12 independent states, and the Iron Curtain dividing East and West fell. Obviously, there are lessons to be drawn and applications for the present and the future, but I'm happy to address those in questions. The question is the significance of the Arab-Israeli Armistice Accord and how that fits in with the title of Great Negotiations, Agreements that Changed the Modern World. It's a fair question. The reason I included it was the first example of a peace signed in the modern Middle East, and as such, I consider it a brick of hope. It's a wonderful story in the sense that in the beginning, the negotiators would neither look at, talk to, or shake hands with each other. It was mediated by a UN mediator named Ralph Bunche, who was a very remarkable individual. And it was an important moment for the development of the United Nations. It was the UN's first great test in matters of war and peace. And the world really looked to see whether the UN would lapse into the problems that had cursed the League of Nations. So it was very important for the Middle East, both because of the agreement that was cut itself and as an emblem of hope. And it was important to the United Nations. So I thought it was worth including. And the question is, how did I choose the negotiations that I included in the book? And the answer is, of course, one of the premises of the book is that there are any number of valuable and important negotiations, and it's something that deserves greater attention. I mean, one of the things I say is that history is traditionally viewed through the lens of either war or biography, and this fills in a missing piece of the puzzle. So there are any number of good candidates. The filters that I used about 3 filters. The first was it obviously had to have a large footprint. It had to affect our lives today in some way. The negotiators at the table had to have the ability to influence the outcome. It couldn't be a simple dictation of terms, and it couldn't be a natural unfolding of larger events. And the third, of course, was there had to be enough material available that I could recreate the give and take of the conversation to put the reader at the table so they have a sense of what happened. There are any number of other negotiations as well that I looked at that would be great candidates. The Alaska Purchase, of course, was important, but I already had the Louisiana Purchase, so I didn't want to have too much purchases in there. Similarly, Camp David was obviously very significant, but I already had the Israeli-Egyptian Armistice Accord. So I used a little bit of discretion, but those were the criteria I used. The question is, has the United States been at a disadvantage until recently because it lacked formal negotiating training. Is that accurate? And it's funny you bring it up because when Monroe went to, when we sent our envoys to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, one of the things that Jefferson instructed them was that the Europeans were so sophisticated in negotiating and were steeped in negotiating and bargaining since birth that they were bound to be at a disadvantage and shouldn't really try anything funny. So I think in that sense, it's almost been a genetic disadvantage for Americans for a very long time. But obviously, one of the points of the book is the better we are able to understand how to negotiate, the less we'll have to apply force. And that negotiating is such an important element in any statesman's toolkit that the better we know how to use it, the more effective we can be. It's a critical skill, and obviously these are moments where negotiating, these are moments where history is decided one way or the other. And if you know what you're doing, you're much better off for it. The question is, does the book consider the domestic constraints to negotiation? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, negotiations don't take place in a vacuum. There are always larger forces beyond the table that influence the proceedings. That happens for instance, in one of the great examples would be in the Treaty of Portsmouth negotiation. One of the reasons the treaty was concluded is that the Russian negotiator disobeyed a specific order from the Tsar to break off the negotiation and return home. He disobeyed that and concluded an agreement he wasn't authorized to conclude because he thought it was the right thing to do. But that was a very risky move. So there are always there are often sidebar negotiations that happen at the state capitol that influence the proceedings at the table, but there's a whole universe of other things going on that are very important, including domestic considerations. Yeah, the question is, in American negotiating abroad, how does the constitutional structure with Senate ratification affect American negotiating positions? Obviously, you put your finger on the big one, of course, was the Treaty of Versailles. And the agreement that Wilson struck was rejected by the Senate. So that was a huge reversal. But in Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev, he mentions that there are certain agreements that he wouldn't be able to sell to the Senate, or there are certain promises that he made to his people that he wanted to abide by. So it provides, if not a cover, a transparent source of limitation of authority that can in certain instances be useful, but of course if pushed too far, then you have what happened to Wilson. So it's, I think it's something that is broadly enough known abroad that people understand that our president has limits to his negotiating ability, and he doesn't have complete agency. Of course, a clever negotiator could use that to his advantage, but it's something that makes American negotiation different from others. The question is, what can be done about Bosnia? That it's been lingering in this mode without a permanent settlement for 15 years, and can something be done to find a solution there?
Who should do it, and what approach should they take?
Yeah, who should do it, and what approach should they take? Outside involvement has helped in the past. When President Roosevelt saw the Russo-Japanese War, the U.S. was considered an impartial arbiter that both parties could look to treat the issue even-handedly. Roosevelt was essentially a distant mediation approach. He wasn't present, but he followed it very closely on a daily basis. And he was able to nudge both sides close enough together that then they could take it from there. The UN obviously is another example with Bunch and the Israeli-Egyptian Armistice Accord. I think it's a situation where the specifics are so much a driver of the situation that I would defer to the experts on that one. I would defer to the other experts on that one. Any other questions? All right, thank you.